The most powerful woman in the building thought she was working late. She had no idea she was about to overhear a lullaby that would change her life. At 2:13 a.m., the 43rd floor of Bennett Global was wrapped in silence. The city lights beyond the glass walls stretched across downtown Chicago like a sea of gold, shimmering beneath a cold spring sky. Most of the employees had gone home hours ago. The conference rooms were dark. The elevators rested. Even the cleaning crews had finished their rounds. But Charlotte Bennett was still awake. The 36-year-old CEO sat alone at the head of a polished walnut table, reviewing financial projections for an upcoming acquisition. Her eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets. Her coffee had gone cold nearly an hour ago. Success had brought her many things: recognition, wealth, influence, but it had also brought long nights and empty rooms. She rubbed her temples and stood, deciding to take a short walk before returning to work. The quiet hallways echoed softly beneath the click of her heels. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere far below, a distant siren faded into the night. Charlotte walked toward the east wing of the building, passing executive offices and locked meeting rooms. Then she heard something unusual. A voice. Soft, gentle, almost impossible to hear. She stopped. At first she thought someone had left a video playing. Then she realized it was singing. Not professionally, not for attention, just a simple voice carrying a melody through the stillness. Curious, she followed the sound. The song drifted from a small security station near the freight elevators. Charlotte slowed her steps. Through the partially open doorway, she saw the night guard. Ethan Walker, 38 years old. Quiet, reliable, the kind of employee most executives never noticed. He sat alone beneath the glow of a desk lamp. One hand rested on a security monitor. The other held a phone to his ear. His expression was calm, patient, and filled with something Charlotte rarely saw inside corporate headquarters. Tenderness. That's right, sweetheart, he whispered between verses. Daddy's still here. A small voice answered from the phone. Charlotte couldn't make out the words. Ethan smiled. Then he continued singing. The melody was old-fashioned. Simple. Warm. The kind of song a parent sings not because they have a beautiful voice, but because someone they love needs to hear it. Charlotte remained frozen in the hallway. She should have walked away. She knew that. Yet something about the moment held her there. The powerful CEO who negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation suddenly found herself unable to take another step. Ethan finished one verse. The little voice answered again. This time Charlotte caught a few words. Good night, Daddy. Ethan's smile deepened. Close your eyes, Emma. I'll stay right here until you fall asleep. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above him. The city glowed beyond the windows. And for reasons Charlotte couldn't explain, the loneliness she carried every night felt heavier than usual. She watched as Ethan lowered his head and began singing once more, his voice barely louder than a whisper. In that moment, surrounded by wealth, glass, and steel, Charlotte Bennett discovered something she had not found in years. Not power, not ambition, not success, something far rarer. A father's quiet love. The next morning, Charlotte Bennett told herself she had forgotten about the song. She had meetings scheduled from 8 o'clock until nearly 6. Investors were flying in from New York. Legal teams were reviewing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. There was no reason for a busy chief executive officer to spend another second thinking about a night guard she barely knew. Yet by noon, she realized she remembered every detail. The softness in his voice, the patience in his words, the way he had remained on the phone long after his daughter had grown quiet. It lingered in her thoughts like a melody that refused to fade. 3 days later, Charlotte found herself working late again. The building was nearly empty. Rain tapped gently against the floor-to-ceiling windows while clouds drifted over the Chicago skyline. She glanced at the clock on her laptop. 2:12 a.m. For a moment, she stared at the numbers. Then she shook her head, almost annoyed with herself. This was ridiculous. She had no intention of checking whether Ethan was making another call. And yet 1 minute later, she was standing in the hallway. At exactly 2:13, the security station light switched on. Ethan appeared carrying a paper cup of coffee. He settled into his chair, picked up his phone, and smiled before the call even connected. Charlotte remained hidden around the corner. Hey, sweetheart, he said softly. Ready for bed? A little girl's laughter floated faintly through the speaker. Ethan's face brightened instantly. It was not the smile employees gave executives. It was not the smile people used during presentations or negotiations. It was real, unfiltered, the smile of a father whose entire world existed on the other end of a phone line. Charlotte listened for only a moment before walking away. She felt strangely guilty, as though she had witnessed something private and precious. But the following night, she noticed the same thing. And the night after that. Every evening, no matter the weather, no matter how late the hour, Ethan called. Every evening, he stayed on the line until Emma fell asleep. Weeks passed. The ritual never changed. One Friday night, Charlotte happened to cross paths with Frank Miller, the head of building operations. They were reviewing maintenance reports when Ethan's name appeared on a staffing schedule. Charlotte tried to sound casual. Walker seems reliable. Frank nodded immediately. Best night guard we have. Really? Never late. Never complains. Covers extra shifts whenever someone gets sick. Frank paused. Honestly, I do not know how he does it. Charlotte looked up. What do you mean? Frank leaned back in his chair. Single father. Long hours. Commutes almost 40 miles round trip every day. Still shows up with a smile. Charlotte said nothing. Frank continued. A lot of people have tougher jobs. A lot of people make more money. But I have never heard him complain once. The conversation moved on, but Charlotte's thoughts remained fixed on those words. That evening, after most of the lights had gone dark, she stood near a conference room window overlooking the city. Far below, headlights flowed through the streets like rivers of white and red. Somewhere inside the building, Ethan was making his nightly call. Charlotte found herself wondering about Emma. What kind of child waited awake every night just to hear her father's voice? And why did the thought of that simple question leave such an unexpected ache inside her heart? The answer arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Charlotte had spent the morning moving from one meeting to another, discussing budgets, staffing projections, and expansion plans. By 3 o'clock, she finally escaped to her office overlooking Lake Michigan. The sunlight reflected off the water in bright silver waves, but her attention drifted elsewhere. Without fully understanding why, she opened an employee file. Ethan Walker, night security officer, hired 4 years earlier. Excellent attendance. Outstanding evaluations. No disciplinary issues. Charlotte skimmed through the information until a small emergency contact form caught her eye. Emma Walker, age 8. She stared at the name for several seconds. The same little voice she had heard through the phone countless nights suddenly felt real. Not just a distant child at the end of a call, but a person. A little girl waiting every evening for her father to sing her to sleep. Later that week, another late night kept Charlotte in the building. Rain streaked across the windows while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city. As she walked toward the executive elevators, she noticed Ethan sitting at his station earlier than usual. His phone was already in his hand. His expression looked different tonight. Concerned. How was school? He asked softly after the call connected. A small voice answered. Ethan smiled, but the worry remained in his eyes. Did you eat dinner? Another answer. He nodded. Good. That makes me happy. Charlotte continued walking, trying not to listen, but a few words reached her anyway. Doctor appointment. Medicine. Feeling tired. She paused briefly before stepping away. The next evening, curiosity finally overcame her. During a conversation with Frank Miller, she carefully asked another question. Does Ethan have family nearby? Frank nodded. His mother-in-law helps with Emma. Mother-in-law. His wife passed away about 5 years ago. Charlotte looked down. Frank's voice softened. Emma was only 3. Silence settled between them. The information hit harder than Charlotte expected. She pictured the empty apartment Ethan probably returned to each morning. She imagined the long drives, the night shifts, the responsibility of raising a child while carrying grief that never completely disappeared. That night, at exactly 2:13, Charlotte found herself standing near the same hallway again. Ethan's voice floated through the quiet building. Do you remember what your mom used to say? He asked gently. A faint answer came through the speaker. Ethan laughed softly. That is right. Brave hearts shine brightest on cloudy days. Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment. The words sounded practiced, repeated many times before. A tradition preserved so a little girl would never forget her mother. The hallway felt unusually still. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Rain tapped against distant windows. Then Emma asked a question. Charlotte could not hear every word, only the final part. When are you coming home? Ethan's smile faded slightly. He glanced at the security monitors and then toward the dark corridors beyond. "Soon, sweetheart," he answered. "I promise." The little voice seemed satisfied. Ethan began singing again, softer than ever. And for the first time, Charlotte realized something important. The nightly calls were not simply a routine. They were a bridge, a fragile thread connecting a father and daughter separated by work, distance, and sacrifice. A thread Ethan protected every single night without fail. As autumn settled over Chicago, the nights grew colder and the wind coming off Lake Michigan carried a sharper edge. Inside Bennett Global, however, one thing remained unchanged. At 2:13 every morning, a father called his daughter. Charlotte no longer pretended she had not noticed. She knew the timing. She knew the routine. And increasingly, she found herself measuring her nights against it. One evening, after a board meeting that stretched nearly 12 hours, Charlotte stepped into the executive elevator exhausted. The acquisition deal that had consumed her entire month was finally complete. Millions of dollars had changed hands. Investors were celebrating. Yet as the elevator descended through 43 floors of glass and steel, she felt strangely empty. When the doors opened, she saw Ethan sitting near the security station reviewing reports. He looked just as calm as always. His uniform was neat. His coffee sat untouched beside him. Charlotte hesitated before approaching. It was the first time she had ever spoken to him directly. "Long night?" she asked. Ethan looked up, slightly surprised. "Good evening, Miss Bennett." His voice carried the same warmth she had heard through the phone. "A little long, yes." Charlotte smiled politely. "Mine too." For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan nodded toward the lobby windows. "The sunrise should be nice tomorrow. Clear skies finally moving in." Charlotte almost laughed. Most people spoke to her about stock prices, market forecasts, or quarterly earnings. This man was talking about the weather. Somehow it felt refreshing. "I hope you are right," she replied. Ethan smiled. "I usually am." Before she could think of another response, his phone vibrated. His eyes immediately softened. Not dramatically, not noticeably to most people, but Charlotte saw it. The change happened every time Emma called. "Excuse me," he said. "Of course." Charlotte walked away. Yet something about that brief exchange stayed with her. The next week brought another surprise. During a quarterly leadership review, department managers gathered to discuss employee recognition awards. Names appeared on a large presentation screen. Sales achievements, management milestones, productivity records. Charlotte listened quietly until she noticed Ethan's name buried near the bottom of a maintenance report. "Who submitted this recommendation?" she asked. A manager raised his hand. "Security department." Charlotte glanced down. "For what?" The manager smiled. "Actually, several things." He opened another file. "He drives employees to their cars during snowstorms. Covers extra shifts during holidays. Helps new hires learn the building. Last Christmas, he even organized a toy drive for staff children." Charlotte looked around the room. And nobody mentioned this before? Several people exchanged glances. One executive shrugged. "He is just the night guard." The room fell silent. Charlotte's expression changed. Not angry, not harsh, simply disappointed. "No," she said quietly. "He is an employee who seems to care about people." Nobody argued. Later that night, Charlotte stood alone near the executive windows watching the city lights shimmer below. Somewhere down the hall, Ethan was beginning his nightly call. For months, she had viewed him as a mystery. A kind voice. A devoted father. But now she was beginning to see something more. Ethan Walker was not extraordinary because he possessed wealth, status, or influence. He was extraordinary because in a world obsessed with being noticed, he quietly chose kindness every single day. And for reasons she still could not explain, that realization lingered in her heart far longer than any business victory ever had. Winter arrived early that year. By the first week of November, icy winds swept through downtown Chicago, rattling the glass panels of Bennett Global long after sunset. The city seemed colder than usual, and for reasons Charlotte could not explain, she found herself paying closer attention to the people around her. Especially one person. It happened on a Thursday night shortly after midnight. A maintenance issue had triggered a minor alarm on one of the upper floors, and several employees stayed late helping resolve it. Charlotte was among the last to leave. As she passed through a quiet corridor near the security office, she noticed a small leather notebook resting on a side table. It looked worn from years of use. At first she intended to walk past it. Then she recognized the name embossed in faded lettering on the cover. Ethan Walker. She immediately stopped. The notebook had likely been forgotten during a shift change. Charlotte picked it up carefully, intending to leave it with security. As she did, a folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages and landed on the floor. She bent down to retrieve it. The paper was old, creased, clearly handled many times. Before she could stop herself, her eyes caught a single line written near the top. Dear Sarah. Charlotte froze. She knew instantly that Sarah had been Ethan's wife. Her heart urged her to look away. Yet something about the sadness contained in those two simple words held her still for a moment longer. She did not continue reading. She could not. It felt too personal, too sacred. She carefully folded the letter exactly as she had found it and placed it back inside the notebook. But the image stayed with her. Dear Sarah. Not Dear Emma. Not a work note. Not a reminder. A letter. Later that evening, Ethan arrived at the security station, looking concerned. The moment Charlotte handed him the notebook, relief washed across his face. Thank you, he said quietly. I did not realize I left it behind. Charlotte hesitated. Important. Ethan glanced down at the notebook. For a second his expression softened. Very. There was a long pause. Then he offered a small smile. My daughter thinks I write too much. Charlotte returned the smile. Maybe that is not a bad thing. Ethan looked at the notebook again. Maybe not. Neither said anything more. Yet after he walked away, Charlotte noticed the careful way he held it, almost as though he were carrying something fragile, something irreplaceable. Over the following days, she could not stop wondering about those letters. Not because of curiosity, but because of what they revealed. Ethan was not simply surviving loss. He was honoring it. Somewhere between raising a daughter, working overnight shifts, and carrying responsibilities most people never saw, he still found time to write to someone who could no longer answer. The realization stayed with her through the weekend. Then one snowy night, as Charlotte passed the security station on her way out, she heard Ethan speaking softly before his call with Emma began. He did not know anyone was listening. You would be proud of her, Sarah, he whispered. She is becoming everything we hoped she would be. Outside, snow drifted silently across the city lights. Inside, the building remained still. And for the first time, Charlotte understood that. Ethan's strength did not come from forgetting the past. It came from carrying love forward, one quiet day at a time. The storm arrived just after midnight. Weather alerts flashed across phones throughout Chicago as freezing rain swept through the city and powerful winds rattled windows across downtown. Inside Bennett Global, only a handful of employees remained. Charlotte was one of them. She had stayed late reviewing final documents for a major project scheduled to launch the following week. Outside, the skyline had nearly disappeared behind sheets of rain. The glass walls trembled softly as gusts pushed against the building. At 1:47 in the morning, Charlotte finally gathered her files and headed for the elevator. The empty hallway echoed beneath her footsteps. The building felt unusually quiet. She stepped inside the executive elevator and pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. The descent began. Then everything went dark. The lights flickered once, twice. The elevator jerked gently and stopped. Silence followed. Complete silence. Charlotte stared at the emergency panel. For the first time in years, she felt a wave of uncertainty. She pressed the emergency button. Nothing happened immediately. The backup lights eventually activated, casting a dim glow across the small space. She took a slow breath and reminded herself to stay calm. Somewhere above, thunder rolled across the city. Several minutes later, a familiar voice crackled through the emergency speaker. Ms. Bennett. Charlotte immediately recognized it. Ethan. Yes, ma'am. Are you all right? Relief washed over her. I am fine. Good. Please stay where you are. Maintenance is on the way, and I am coming up now. His tone remained steady, reassuring. The same tone he used with Emma every night. Charlotte leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Somehow hearing his voice made the situation feel less serious. 15 minutes later, she heard movement outside the elevator doors. Tools shifted. Instructions were exchanged. Then Ethan's voice appeared again. We have everything under control. Charlotte smiled despite herself. You sound very confident. A brief chuckle came through the speaker. My daughter says that means I am stubborn. Charlotte laughed softly. The sound surprised even her. Minutes passed. The storm continued to roar outside, But inside the elevator, an unexpected conversation began. They talked about simple things. Coffee, Chicago winters, favorite places to watch the sunrise. Nothing important. Yet somehow it felt more genuine than many conversations Charlotte had during board meetings. Finally, the doors opened. Ethan stood outside beneath the glow of emergency lights. Rainwater clung to his jacket from crossing parts of the building during the storm. He extended a hand to help her step across the narrow gap. Charlotte accepted it. For a brief moment their eyes met. Neither spoke. Neither looked away immediately. Then Ethan released her hand and stepped back respectfully. "You are safe now." Charlotte nodded. "Thank you." Ethan glanced toward the security monitors mounted nearby. His expression suddenly changed. Concern flickered across his face. He checked the time. 2:12 a.m. 1 minute before his nightly call. Charlotte noticed instantly. Without saying a word, Ethan reached for his phone. Seconds later, his face softened as Emma answered. Standing beneath emergency lights while the storm battered the city outside, Charlotte watched him smile at the sound of his daughter's voice. And somehow, after everything that had happened that night, that simple moment affected her more than being rescued ever could. The days following the storm felt different. Not dramatically, not in ways anyone else would notice. But for Charlotte Bennett, something had quietly shifted. She still arrived before most employees and often left after everyone else. She still negotiated contracts and led meetings and carried the weight of an entire corporation on her shoulders. Yet now, in unexpected moments, her thoughts drifted elsewhere. They drifted toward a man who never asked for attention and a little girl she had never met. One cold December afternoon, Charlotte was reviewing employee healthcare reports when a particular file caught her attention. It was not unusual for executives to approve benefit requests, but one entry made her pause. Emma Walker, pediatric cardiology follow-up, recommended treatment plan pending insurance approval. Charlotte stared at the document longer than necessary. Her chest tightened slightly. She remembered the snippets of conversation she had overheard. Doctor appointments, medicine, feeling tired. Suddenly those words carried greater meaning. She closed the file and leaned back in her chair. Outside her office window, snow drifted slowly across the city. The sky hung low and gray over Lake Michigan. For several minutes, she sat quietly. Then she picked up the phone. "Melissa," she said to her executive assistant. "I need a favor." "Of course. I want to create a private employee assistance grant." There was a brief pause. "For who?" Charlotte looked toward the falling snow. No names attached. No publicity. No announcements. Melissa understood immediately. Understood. Within days, the necessary approvals were completed. Medical expenses that had worried Ethan for months quietly disappeared through an anonymous employee support fund. No explanation was given. No credit was claimed. The paperwork simply arrived. Ethan never learned where it came from. Several nights later, Charlotte happened to pass the security station just as Ethan finished reading a letter. He looked confused. Not upset. Just overwhelmed. He turned the paper over several times as though trying to solve a puzzle. Then he smiled softly and looked upward. "Thank you," he whispered to nobody in particular. Charlotte kept walking before he noticed her. Yet hearing those two words filled her with an unexpected warmth. A week later, another surprise arrived. Near the end of his shift, Ethan received a video call instead of a regular phone call. Charlotte happened to be nearby reviewing security updates. Emma's bright face appeared on the screen. Her smile instantly lit up the small security office. "Daddy, look what I made." She proudly held up a drawing covered in colorful markers. Ethan laughed. "That is beautiful. It is our family." Charlotte glanced over unintentionally. The drawing showed 3 stick figures beneath a bright yellow sun. Ethan pointed gently. "I know who I am." Emma giggled. "And I know who Grandma is." Ethan smiled. "Then who is the third person?" Emma looked thoughtful for a second. Then she shrugged. "I do not know yet." Ethan laughed again. The sound echoed softly through the empty hallway. Charlotte walked away before she heard more. Yet those simple words lingered with her all evening. "I do not know yet." Back in her office, she stood beside the darkened window overlooking the city lights. Thousands of people moved through Chicago below. Thousands of stories. Thousands of lives. And somehow, among all of them, the one that occupied her heart belonged to a father who sang lullabies through a phone and a little girl who still believed there was room in her drawing for someone she had not met yet. By the time December reached its final week, Bennett Global was preparing for its annual Employee Appreciation Gala. The event was one of the company's biggest traditions. Executives flew in from across the country. Department leaders gathered from regional offices. Hundreds of employees filled the grand ballroom of a historic downtown hotel decorated with winter lights and evergreen garlands. For most people, it was simply another corporate celebration. For Charlotte Bennett, it had become something more. As guests settled into their seats beneath crystal chandeliers, soft music drifted through the room. Waitstaff moved quietly between tables. Laughter echoed from every corner. Yet Charlotte's attention remained fixed on a single seat near the back of the ballroom. Ethan Walker sat alone, looking slightly uncomfortable in a borrowed suit. He had only attended because his supervisor insisted. He clearly preferred quiet hallways to crowded events. When Charlotte stepped onto the stage, the room gradually fell silent. She welcomed everyone, thanked the employees for another successful year, and spoke about teamwork, perseverance, and growth. The audience applauded politely. Then she paused. Her expression softened. "Tonight," she said, "I would like to recognize a kind of success that does not appear on financial reports." The room grew quieter. Charlotte glanced toward the back of the ballroom. Sometimes the most important people in an organization are the ones most of us never notice. Employees exchanged curious looks. Several department heads leaned forward. Charlotte continued, "We celebrate leadership. We celebrate innovation. We celebrate achievement. But tonight, I want to celebrate character." The large screen behind her illuminated. At first, nobody understood what they were seeing. It was a simple audio waveform. Nothing more. Then a voice filled the ballroom. Gentle. Familiar. A father singing. Ethan froze. Across the room, conversation stopped instantly. Forks lowered. Glasses remained untouched. The lullaby drifted softly through the speakers. There was no professional music. No orchestra. No production value. Only sincerity. Only love. Charlotte watched as hundreds of people listened in complete silence. Some smiled. Others lowered their eyes. A few quietly wiped away tears. The recording ended. For several seconds nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room remained completely still. Charlotte finally broke the silence. For nearly a year, a father has ended every workday the same way. Not seeking recognition. Not asking for praise. Simply making sure his daughter falls asleep, knowing she is loved. Ethan looked down at the table, overwhelmed. Charlotte continued. Many people know his job title. Very few know his story. She spoke about dedication. About kindness. About covering shifts for coworkers. About helping employees during snowstorms. About showing up every day with grace despite carrying burdens most people never saw. The audience listened without interruption. Then Charlotte smiled. "Mr. Ethan Walker, would you please join me on stage?" For a moment he did not move. The room erupted into applause. Not the polite applause given at corporate events. Something warmer. Something deeper. Ethan slowly stood. As he walked toward the stage, employees rose from their chairs one after another until the entire ballroom stood with him. The standing ovation seemed endless. Ethan reached the stage and looked out across hundreds of faces. He appeared completely stunned. Charlotte handed him a small plaque recognizing exceptional character and service. Ethan stared at it before finally looking up. "I do not know what to say." His voice cracked slightly. Charlotte smiled. "You already said it every night." The ballroom fell silent once more. And in that silence, everyone finally understood what she meant. The gala ended, but its impact lingered long after the final guests left the ballroom. In the weeks that followed, something subtle began to change. Employees who had once hurried past the security desk now stopped to say good morning. Managers who barely knew Ethan's name greeted him with respect. Yet the recognition never seemed to affect him. He remained the same man he had always been. He arrived on time. He worked hard. And every night at 2:13, he called Emma. One bright Saturday morning in early spring, nearly 4 months after the gala, Ethan received an unexpected invitation. Charlotte asked if he and Emma would join her for lunch at a small lakeside cafe overlooking Lake Michigan. At first he hesitated. Then Emma heard about the invitation and immediately decided for him. "Daddy, you have to go." Her excitement made it impossible to refuse. The afternoon arrived with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze rolling across the water. Ethan pulled into the parking lot in his aging pickup truck while Emma practically bounced in her seat. Charlotte was already waiting outside. She wore simple clothes instead of a business suit, and for the first time, she looked less like the chief executive officer of a major corporation and more like an ordinary woman enjoying a beautiful day. Emma spotted her first. "Miss Charlotte." The little girl rushed forward before Ethan could say a word. Charlotte laughed and knelt to greet her. Within minutes, they were talking as though they had known each other for years. They shared lunch beside the lake, watching sailboats drift across the water. Emma talked about school, books, and the latest drawing she had completed. Charlotte listened to every word. Ethan mostly watched, quietly amazed. At one point, Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I made a new family picture," she announced proudly. Charlotte smiled. "Can I see it?" Emma handed over the drawing. Ethan immediately recognized it. The same bright yellow sun. The same simple figures standing together. But this time there was a difference. There were 4 people instead of 3. Charlotte studied the drawing carefully. "Who are they?" Emma pointed. "That is me." Then she pointed again. "That is Daddy." Another figure. "That is Grandma." Finally, she pointed to the 4th person. A woman standing beside them beneath the sun. Charlotte looked at her quietly. "And who is that?" Emma smiled. "I know now." Silence followed. Not an awkward silence. Not a painful one. The kind of silence that arrives when a heart recognizes something before words can explain it. Ethan looked toward the lake. The sunlight danced across the water like scattered gold. Charlotte lowered the drawing and met his eyes. Neither spoke for a moment. They did not need to. Because sometimes the most important things are not said during board meetings, speeches, or grand celebrations. Sometimes they are found in small moments. A shared smile. A child's drawing. A quiet afternoon by the water. And that evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the Chicago skyline, Emma fell asleep without needing a phone call for the first time in years. Not because her father loved her any less, but because he was finally home. And for the first time in a very long time, none of them were alone.